Enlightened Conversations, everybody. And here's your host, Lisa Smith.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a beautiful evening in April. We're here this evening to talk about a topic that is kind of near and dear to my heart, and that is accessibility. I am, full disclosure here this evening, I am mobility challenged. I have difficulty getting around. On good days, I hobble about on a cane and can pretty much get from point A to point B, as long as those 2 points aren't more than about 10 steps apart. But put them a little further apart, put some steps in between them, make them on a slant, and I am in trouble. So I then have to rely on other means. Sometimes 2 canes, sometimes a walker. Other days it's a wheelchair or my bright red little candy apple red scooter. But depending on the day and where I'm going, I can generally get around. And that depends greatly on where I'm going. And that's pretty much like everybody else. You know, every day people come and go from various places to work, to shop, to entertainment venues. They go to restaurants, movie theaters, even tourist attractions. And they don't give a thought to how they will get in the door, how they'll get from a parking lot to the door, or if they can get in, will they need to stand for any period of time, or can they get a seat? Unless they are folks like me, folks who are mobility challenged. That we thought was going to be corrected in 1990 with the beginning of the ADA, the accessibility portion of the Americans with Disability Act. And there have been various regulations since that time. But things don't always work out the way that they're planned. So we're going to take a look at that tonight. What has worked, what hasn't worked, what have some businesses tried to do to help those of us who are mobility challenged when maybe the laws aren't quite as clear or don't make it as easy as perhaps it should be. We have with us tonight 2 speakers. Our first speaker is Rocco Iacullo, who is with Disability Rights Pennsylvania. He's going to take us through step by step what this law means and how it's applied to various businesses. And then at some point later on, when she's available, we'll be joined by Justine Truxas, who is the executive director of Main Street Hanover. And she's going to talk to us about how some of our local businesses have been able to be a little creative in answering the needs of mobility challenged folks and still deal with some of the historic buildings that they are trying to work in. So let's take a look first at the legal aspects of it. Rocco, welcome to the show. Tell us what you can about ADA and accessibility.
Thank you for having me, Lisa, to discuss these very important issues. I actually am going to start. I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint presentation for tonight. And so I just wanted to start with a brief introduction for myself. So yes, my name is Rocco Iacullo. I am a staff attorney with Disability Rights Pennsylvania, and I will be presenting a basic overview of the accessibility requirements for public accommodations under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have been an attorney with Disability Rights Pennsylvania for many years now, and I specifically have counseled many clients with disabilities regarding their rights under the various civil rights laws, including the ADA, the Fair Housing Act, and other major disability civil rights laws. And I have also engaged in litigation over various matters over the years as well. Just a brief background, Disability Rights Pennsylvania is an independent statewide nonprofit corporation that is designated as the federally mandated protection and advocacy organization in Pennsylvania. DRP protects and advocates for the rights of people with disabilities so that they may live the lives they choose, free from abuse, neglect, discrimination, and segregation. To get started, I just want to give a brief overview of who Title III applies to. And Title III applies to private entities that own, lease to, or operate any place of public accommodation. Now, public accommodation is defined by 312 broad categories. I've listed some examples here that you can read for yourself. There are 12 in total. But the first one you can see are hotels or other places of lodging, restaurants, bars, or food or drink service establishments, and the list goes on. So it does cover a broad array of businesses that provide goods and services to the public. The main focus tonight in my talk is going to be on the accessibility requirements for existing facilities. So what I mean by that is any business, let's say, that might be located in a downtown section of a city, like a pizza shop or a bakery or anything like that, which a lot of those are located in older buildings that may have been built before the ADA was passed in 1990. And so specifically with regards to the obligations of those businesses, the ADA requires those public accommodations to remove architectural barriers in existing facilities where such removal is readily achievable. Now, readily achievable is defined broadly as anything that is easily accomplishable and able to be carried out without much difficulty or expense. So what does that mean exactly? Well, the ADA implementing regulations provide some guidance in the form of a list of factors that a business needs to look at to determine whether a specific barrier removal measure would be readily achievable. For instance, the nature and cost of the action, the overall financial resources of the site or sites, the size of the entity, overall financial resources of any parent corporation or entity, and the type of operation.
Rocco, can I interrupt for a second? What if
Yes.
the business is renting their facility? Can they, do those rules apply to the owner or to the business that is renting the facility?
Actually, it applies to both. And so if I can go back a couple of slides, that's why I did
That own,
mention
lease,
there that it
yes,
applies to private entities that own, lease
or
to,
lease
or operate.
to.
So that
Okay.
would include both the business itself as well as the
As,
landlord who is leasing the
okay.
space to them. So you know, again, both of those would be on the hook. Now they can decide between the two of them who's going to be responsible for making changes. At the end of the day, you know, it doesn't necessarily matter who complies with the ADA as long as they remove the barrier. But yes, both of them can be on the hook.
Both of them. Okay.
So in terms of any measures that are taken to comply with the readily achievable barrier removal requirement, those actions have to comply with the ADA accessibility standards, which essentially consist of um, Department of Justice regulations that provide some scoping rules, as well as the 2004 ADA accessibility guidelines that have the specific design requirements for things like accessible parking and accessible routes, and a long list of elements that might be required to be accessible. Now, when we're talking about barrier removal priorities, the Department of Justice has put a focus on something that makes a lot of sense, which is the concept of getting through the door. So the highest priority is given to taking measures that will enable people with disabilities to physically enter a place of public accommodation. So for instance, if you have that pizza shop again that has a small step to the entrance of their shop, um, that is a barrier that typically could be removed by the easy installation of a ramp to remove that barrier. And so again, the focus is going to be taking measures that would allow the person to enter the facility. Besides entering the facility, then the other priorities are just providing access to the areas where goods and services are made available, making sure that there are accessible restroom facilities, and then finally, any other measures necessary to provide access to the goods and services of the business. Again, here is just a list of some examples that the Department of Justice lists in the ADA regulations. These are examples of barrier removal measures that 9 times out of 10 will likely be considered readily achievable. You can see things like repositioning shelves, rearranging tables and chairs, widening doorways. They're things that are not going to involve a lot of cost or involve a lot of alterations required to the business. But even things like installing curb cuts or ramps and installing accessible parking spaces are generally going to be viewed as readily achievable. So there is some flexibility built into the ADA with regards to readily achievable barrier removal. So for instance, if after going through the analysis, a business determines that it would not be readily achievable to remove a particular barrier or to be able to comply fully with the ADA accessibility standards, then they would be allowed to take other measures to remove the barriers that maybe do not comply with the full ADA accessibility standard. So for example, that could include providing a ramp with a slightly steeper slope than is allowed by the accessibility standards, or widening a doorway to a slightly narrower width than that mandated by the ADA standards, because that would at least provide some accessibility to some individuals with disabilities. But again, it's going to be a pretty high standard in terms of when a business would be allowed to do that. So again, it's either going to be when they can't fully comply with the standards, or as we see on the next slide, if you're dealing with a historic building, for instance, and the alterations that would be required, might be exempted because the business either is not allowed to impact the historic, or it is a historic building and it might affect a historic aspect of the building. Then again, they would be allowed to comply to the accessibility standards to the maximum extent feasible, again, by maybe providing a slightly steeper ramp or some other measure that does not comply fully with the ADA standards. And then only if it would not be feasible to take any or make any physical accessibility changes. Only then would they be able to provide alternative methods of access. And we'll get into that in a minute about what are allowable alternative methods of access. Some other specific rules, the ADA looks down upon and frowns upon the use of portable ramps, only when the installation of a permanent ramp is not readily achievable. The idea there is that portable ramps are not necessarily as usable for people with disabilities and are not necessarily as safe. In instances where a portable ramp might be allowed, the regulations are very clear that the business should make sure that the portable ramp has safety features such as non-slip surfaces, railings, anchoring, and is pretty strong. And so again, even when they are allowed, DOJ really wants those additional safety features to be added. Now, again, alternatives to barrier removal, again, would only be allowed where a public accommodation could demonstrate that the barrier removal is not readily achievable. In that instance, the ADA would allow alternative accommodations. For instance, maybe providing curb service or home delivery of, let's say, baked goods, or again, take out food from a restaurant, retrieving merchandise from inaccessible shelves or racks, or relocating activities to accessible locations. There is no grandfathering in the ADA, which is a question we get a lot from businesses. Well, we've been in this building that is, 60 years old, and so we think that we should be grandfathered from the requirements. Well, there is no grandfathering under the ADA. The obligation to remove architectural barriers is an ongoing obligation. So from the day that the ADA became effective until today, businesses have an ongoing obligation to identify barriers and remove them, again, when it's readily achievable to do so. There is no grandfathering due to age or the fact that, again, they're occupying an existing building. The only analysis is whether it is readily achievable to remove the identified barriers. There is a safe harbor provision, though, in the ADA, which essentially deals with the fact that in 2010, the ADA standards were amended, and there were some new requirements imposed at that point in time. And so the safe harbor says that if you were operating in an existing facility prior to 2010, and you had previously complied with the 1991 ADA standards, and if the restaurant has not been further altered, then you would not have to take affirmative actions to comply with the 2010 standards. So there is a safe harbor. It's not grandfathering necessarily. Finally, I did want to take a moment to talk about the ADA alterations requirements, because besides the obligation to remove architectural barriers that are readily achievable, the other requirement that would likely apply to a business in an existing facility would be any time they might undertake physical alterations to their business. So the ADA imposes a requirement that when you alter an existing facility or any part of an existing facility, those alterations must be completed so that they're readily accessible to and usable by people with disabilities, including those who use wheelchairs. And in those instances, they have to fully comply with the ADA alterations accessibility requirements that we spoke about earlier. Just quickly, an alteration is defined very broadly in the ADA to include any change to a building or facility that affects or could affect its usability. So that can include things like remodeling, renovation, rehabilitation, reconstruction, etc. Alterations normally do not include maintenance, re-roofing, painting, or changes to mechanical or electrical systems unless they affect usability in some way. And then finally, there's a more specific alteration requirement that says anytime a public accommodation is altering a primary function area, so let's say it's a bowling alley and they're modifying the bowling lanes, then at that point, not only do they need to make sure that the immediate area where the bowling lanes are accessible, but they also have to make sure that the path of travel to the bowling lanes is accessible, as well as the restrooms, drinking fountains, and public telephones. So again, even though they're not touching that they're not touching that route or the restrooms, they would have to make them accessible if that's on the route to that area of primary function that is being altered. So again, this is the other major accessibility requirement, under the ADA, anytime a business undertakes physical alterations. Now, briefly, I do have a slide here. Anytime that you have questions about accessibility or whether or not your business has to, undertake barrier removal, or again, any questions about accessibility, the U.S. Department of Justice is there. There are a plethora of guidance documents and resources available on their website. And then you can also give them a call. They have the ADA information line to answer questions, but also to accept complaints from people with disabilities about accessibility barriers and possible ADA violations. And then besides DOJ, obviously reaching out to Disability Rights Pennsylvania, that a main function of what we do is provide intake services to folks out there to provide legal advice. So if anyone has individuals with disabilities have questions, they can reach out to us and we can review a particular issue with them. And then, yeah, I just have a slide for questions, but I'll leave that up to you, Lisa, in terms of how to handle the questions.
Okay. Well, I had mentioned to you off camera, Rocco, that there was a particular situation that I wanted to bring to your attention just to see how you would react, because I think it would be interesting for our listeners to know when they encounter a situation where they can't get into something, what should they do? Your first reaction, of course, is to get angry. And then your second reaction is to go off and, complain to somebody. But what is the appropriate action to take? So let me explain this scenario to you. This actually happened to me not too terribly long ago. I was on my way to a meeting and got delayed. And when I arrived at the meeting, was in a very large facility. I took what happened to be the last parking spot available. And luckily for me, it was a handicapped accessible parking spot. It was in the lower parking level of this particular building. And the building is built on a hill. So there's an upper level with a main entrance, and there are 2-3 parking spots designated for handicap parking there. And then there's a lower level where you drive down a small hill, parking there, one designated handicap parking spot. And there is a back entrance. So the handicap parking spot was about 12 spots, 12 parking spaces, 10 to 12 parking spaces from that entrance. So I, parked the car and grabbed my cane, and I'm hurrying as fast as I can to get to that back entrance because I knew it was the only door that was open. I had seen some other people trying other doors because I wasn't the only one that was late, and that none of the other doors were opening for them. But I had seen other people get in that back door, so I thought, okay, I can make it. And I got to the where the back door is, and there's no curb cut. The curb is a good 10 to 11 inches high, and there's no curb cut. Now, I can't step up 10 or 11 inches. So, and of course, it took me a while to get those 10 to 12 parking spots navigated, that area navigated to get to that back door. Everyone else was inside. So there I stood trying to figure out, how am I going to get in this door? And it took me a couple of 2-3 minutes to figure out a plan, but by hook or by crook, I figured out how to, pull one leg up and get it on there and drop down to a little football stance and basically crawled to the pole that was holding up the roof over that door and kind of crawled my way in. Not a very dignified entrance, I must say. But I got in there, and I was kind of fit to be tied by the time I got in, but I made it in, was able to get through the day, didn't mention it to anybody because I was afraid if I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure that I would like the language that came out. So I didn't do anything. Now, question, were they in the wrong, or was I simply unfortunate because I was late and took the last available parking spot? If there's a handicap parking spot designated in that parking lot, should there not be a curb cut?
So to answer your question, possibly that may have been an ADA violation. A lot of times when you're analyzing these specific cases, there are a lot of moving parts. So I think the first thing I would say that I would be interested in finding out is what type of building this was, or business.
I'm sorry, what
Type of business?
Oh, it was a large conference center.
Okay. So assuming that is a public accommodation under Title III of the ADA, I would say the first question I would have is at that main entrance on the top floor, do they have enough accessible parking at that entrance? Because the required number of parking spaces is set forth in a chart in the accessibility standards, and it's based on the total number of parking spaces that are available. So it's a certain percentage of the total number of parking spaces. So I would want to know the answer to that question first, because it could be that they don't have enough accessible parking at the main entrance. That could be one issue.
Okay.
Sometimes when you're dealing with multi-level, where there's almost more than one main floor or one floor that can be accessed from a parking lot, those things can get complicated. But again, generally speaking, if there's an entrance usable by the general public that can be accessed from those separate parking lots, then each of those parking lots would have to have their own accessible parking spaces. And so assuming that would be required here, then yes, that would be an ADA violation, number one, for not having those accessible spaces on the closest accessible route to that entrance. And number two, not having an accessible route from the parking space to the entrance, i.e. the fact that there was no curb ramp. So yes, that is likely or could likely be an ADA violation again, in terms of maybe not having the requisite number of spaces at that main entrance, but also the fact that the accessible parking on that lower level is much farther away from the entrance and does not have an accessible route to the
That's true.
entrance.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So
I'm still
yes,
toying with the idea of addressing it in a letter, to the owner, but I thought, since I knew I was going to be talking to you, I thought I might want to just double check what the law calls for. Because I know I've run into those kinds of situations before. And I know I'm not the only one,
right.
various other people have as well. And I think sometimes it comes down to how people interpret the regulations. And also, I think some of it has to do with not having put yourself in that situation. It's
Absolutely.
one thing to read the regulations and follow them, even if you're following them to the letter of the law. But unless you have been in those shoes, so to speak, or in that chair, if that's the case, it's hard to sometimes to see through, all the different nuances.
Exactly. A lot of times you can, when we're dealing with businesses, and trying to get them to understand the requirements, if we're trying to help a client, you can kind of feel the annoyance on their
Yeah,
part that, oh, why do we have to do this? And I think you're right. People who have family members with disabilities or have disabilities themselves, they would not view it as an annoyance. I think they would understand more fully that it may seem on paper like a minor thing to them, but it's not. It can actually prevent people who use wheelchairs and mobility devices from having any access. And so I agree with you. The fact that they don't have their own personal experience with disabilities sometimes makes it hard for them to understand the importance of a curb ramp that they typically would probably look at as being something minor. That's hugely important to a wheelchair user.
right.
So
Yeah. A wheelchair user or a parent with a stroller or,
exactly.
variety of things. So, Justine, you have seen some of our local businesses, though, get really creative in putting themselves in the wheels or the feet of people with disabilities. And maybe you can share with our viewers some of the things that I know that you have tipped me off to as a downtown patron of what some of our local businesses have done to accommodate people while they investigate other possibilities
Mhm.
for accessibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize for kind of the on and off. Thank you for having me a part of this conversation, Lisa. I'm Justine Truxas, Executive Director, Main Street, Hanover. So while I am not an expert at all on ADA and accessibility issues, I have seen real world implementation of ways in which to ensure that businesses are welcoming. And it's something that as a community, I think where accessibility really comes into play is ensuring that all the businesses and all of the spaces can be welcoming. So how can you creatively come up with ways in which to ensure that businesses can be accessible? I think two of my favorite examples, and I won't name kind of different spaces, but I'll say that one business that I'm very familiar with, they are down a flight of stairs. And so the building they're located in has an elevator, but the elevator is accessible through the first floor and it's a locked door because of the apartment complex that it's located within. And so individuals with mobility needs can ring the bell that's there at the top of the stairs beside the business, and they can then be buzzed into the building and use the elevator to access this business on the first floor of that space. And I found that that was a really creative way to use the elevator that was placed in the building while still honoring the kind of nature of a secure apartment building where folks do live. So I think that that was one of the most creative ways that I've seen someone really work outside the box to make their space accessible. And then the other one that I want to point out as well that I've seen recently is it's in an older building as well. It's an establishment that has multiple levels to it with a couple stairs getting up and down in either direction. And this business was able to utilize a grant, which is something I do want to talk about maybe in a little bit, but they were able to get a business grant, a small business grant, to purchase what is a stair mover. And it's not something that, you know, is kind of usable every day. I mean, people aren't necessarily using it every day, but I will say that it does allow for wheelchairs to be used safely to get up and down a smaller flight of stairs. So it is something that ensures that the patron can make it into the spaces in which they want to be in this establishment, which I find to be incredibly valuable. And of course, you know, service can be provided on all levels. So if they are on the first level, they can get service there. However, if they did want to make sure that they can access the other areas, that is also available too, which I think is incredibly smart because not only does it ensure that you're welcoming to everyone, it just makes people more comfortable. Because as I was preparing for this talk tonight, I was researching, and it's an old stat, but it's shared on Main Street America, which we are an accredited Main Street program. They shared that I think it's 1 in 4 individuals will at some point in their life, they themselves or a family member will need mobility aids or use something to help with some sort of mobility that they are needing. So I think it really is not just about folks who have mobility kind of issues throughout their life. It's really could be at any point in your life. And I think it was you, Rocco, who said, you know, or maybe it was Lisa, I'm sorry, about even a stroller. I think that's something that we don't necessarily think about. Like, this isn't just about mobility or people who we consider to be to be covered under ADA, but really it's this kind of idea of serving people from 8 to 80, ensuring that you're welcoming to folks throughout the spectrum of life and making sure that you do have that welcoming ability to provide service to everyone who wants to utilize it.
Yeah, and it's critical, I think, to maintaining as a business, to maintaining your bottom dollar.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you want to make sure that every person who comes to your business and has interest in supporting you as a company has the ability to get in there and spend their money on you. You know, I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I've been surprised. My husband and I are doing some research on a possible road trip later on this year, and I have been surprised really at some of the tourist attractions that have very clearly said that they cannot accommodate you if you have certain disabilities, that they are too small to fit a wheelchair, or it's too tight to fit certain types of things. And they will provide another means for you to view what they, you know, what attractions they have for you to see, but they cannot take you up in their tower to see out or whatever. And I was quite surprised because for some of them, they charge a fair amount of money to take you up to see what it is they want you to see. So, and I was glad that they said that right up front, to be quite frank, because if they can't accommodate you, then I just assume no. But I was surprised at the fact that there actually were a few. And then on the other hand, there were a number of state parks, federal parks, national outdoor facilities that very clearly had handicap accessible hiking trails and you know, that sort of thing, that I could even run that little cherry red scooter over if I chose to, that they were that accommodating for folks, which is great to know. That's good to know. Rocco, have you seen any unusual applications of accessibility accommodations in your work?
I think the thing that often comes up is a lot of advocates have done one-step campaigns because there are a lot of downtown areas like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg as well, where they're essentially the only barrier to people use wheelchairs from accessing the business is one step into the store. And generally speaking, it would be held to be readily achievable for those businesses to install a ramp, but a lot of businesses just don't seem to understand their obligation. But there are some times where there are complications. You know, the sidewalk is not big enough to install a ramp, things like that. And so I know in Pittsburgh, I haven't seen it firsthand, but I did hear from some advocates out there where, they had looked at maybe multiple businesses on one block getting together to maybe do one ramp that goes up and provides access to multiple businesses instead of just one. This way, it gave them more room for the ramp run. And then they could do sort of like an elevated concrete a platform, not platform, but like almost like a patio in front. And then you could access multiple stores.
Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah.
So that's something that I think, should be considered more so. And that really would require the involvement of local governments, who I think, while they don't necessarily have a legal argument to or a legal requirement to you know go around and make sure that the private businesses are complying with the ADA, although there are some instances that they might. Generally speaking, they're not, and so they oftentimes don't get involved with that type of creative solutions with businesses. And I think if everyone could collaborate more, both the local governments with the private businesses, they could come up with more solutions like that to provide broader accessibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are really as many creative ideas as you can come up with. There are places who have tried that. And I think it's amazing to see what some businesses have done. Especially if you travel at all, you see some really, I've seen those one block ramps that take you over, the past several storefronts, or in Provincetown, Massachusetts. I know there's a ramp off the one parking lot that will take you around the entire square, the downtown square. It's like a boardwalk almost. And that's great that you can, go right from the main municipal parking lot up and around to all of those businesses. And that's pretty good for a town that you figure is some 500 years old. They've got some ancient sidewalks in that town. So
I think what I like that is very right on, because if towns like that can create those creative solutions, then any town can. I think
exactly
what I want to mention is the financial kind of output that can come with some of these options. I really wish that I knew of or had some ideas on how to help small businesses or property owners to afford these projects, because I do find that is kind of some of the conversation that I hear sometimes. Did you speak on that earlier in the conversation? Because I know that we've used small business grants locally that we've been able to support accessibility with, but I have not necessarily found some great resources for those kinds of things.
Are
There
you aware
are,
of any sources?
well, right. So I did have it in my original PowerPoint, but just in the interest of time, I took it out. There are federal tax credits that
Oh,
small businesses
okay.
can access. And I was trying to see if I could maybe find it's basically for businesses that may have less than $1 million in profits, and I think no more than so many employees. And while they're not, you know, the most money, it does allow for I think up to like $10,000 towards the cost of like physical alterations to make the business more accessible. So there are tax credits that are available for them that they can utilize to help offset the cost of accessibility improvements.
That's good to
That,
know.
yeah, that is. And I would think $1 million in profits and not too terribly many employees is going to cover quite a few small businesses. You
Mhm.
know, the larger companies are going to probably be in a better position to pay for something like this and amortize it over a period of a number of years.
Sure.
So, and I'm wondering, Justine, if it might not be feasible and to look into some of the larger organizations that fund programs for like AARP or organizations for disabled persons. There is a company called Accessibility Go, which is a travel organization. Maybe organizations like that may have grants to help, particularly if it's a tourist type. I'm thinking they might have funds for something that is tourist in nature. But even AARP might have something along those lines. So
Yeah, that 8 to 80 phrase I used earlier is one of their really popular lines that they use because
yes.
we do fund projects, and that's a big kind of point of theirs. One of their major pillars of work is to try to improve walkability in communities and accessibility for folks from 8 to 80 is how they phrase
Right.
it. And so
Absolutely.
I have enjoyed working with them, and I think that's a great idea, Lisa, to reach out more
Yeah, to check
see.
and see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I take it since Lou is not signed back on that we have had no one chiming in tonight from the ether with any questions. It's just been amongst the three of us. So I am going to take it upon myself to wrap it up unless either of the two. Oh, there he is. So anything, Lou, that's come in from?
We've had a couple of comments that
Well, good.
basically commiserate with you, Lisa, and your story of accessibility and how they feel that was very unfair and that you shouldn't have had to deal with that kind of situation.
Yeah. Well, I am certainly not the only one. Yeah, I'm certainly not the only one. So I think that's an everyday occurrence for a lot of folks, unfortunately. So, and hopefully we can, spread the word a little bit and get people to do those sorts of things, put some cuts into curbs and make accessibility not so much a four-letter word amongst people who revamp buildings and that sort of thing. So, but when you're stubborn like I am, Lou, you figure out a way to get in there, so it worked out. But but thank you to those who wrote in. So I'm glad they weren't there with a camera in hand. So that was the good thing. So, but I do appreciate Rocco and Justine. I appreciate your words of wisdom tonight and your enlightenment on this topic. I think maybe, hopefully, if we get a couple of people to think about this a little differently, and maybe we can find some grants for them, we can get some things turned around. And if other folks have had experiences like mine, they may, look at this a little differently, and they'll know what to say when they, get their dander up and decide maybe later to write a letter of complaint, or just to point it out to a building or business owner that, this isn't quite right. You could do something a little bit better. But thank you for sharing your wisdom this evening. We have one more enlightened conversation this season here before we take the summer off. And that is May 16th. We will be involving a topic on aging, and we're going to look at all of those issues with Kathy Bollinger, looking at all of the issues that you really feel you need to talk to your parents about, but you aren't quite certain you want to raise those issues. They had the same issues with us when we were teenagers. All of those topics they didn't want to have that conversation with us about. Now we're turning the tables and we don't want to have certain conversations with them. But Kathy's going to show us how to talk about some of those delicate topics. Like, do you have a DNR, Mom? Do you have a will? Do you know what you're going to do when that time comes? So Kathy will lead us through that conversation on May 16th. So between now and then, I invite you to take a look at our past video recordings of Enlightened Conversations. Lou keeps a fantastic library for us of everything we've done, which is, 20 something, I think, Lou, of all of our.
This is number 24, and we've been doing this for about 3 years now.
Yeah, we've been busy. And he is also recording them as podcasts, along with our new She Rose podcasts. And Justine is one of our She Rose. So these are podcasts about empowered women who help empower other women. So you'll find all of those in wherever you find your typical podcast recordings, as well as listed on the YWCA website. And I wanted to bring to your attention, as we get ready to publish our summer newsletter, a big event we have coming up for our teenagers, June 19th to the 21st. We are offering our first 3-day summit in civil rights for teenagers called Summit for a Better Tomorrow. It's a teen summit on diversity, human rights, and making our community a better place to live. Lou has information on the website about that, and registration is happening now. It's a nominal fee for 3 days of information, including a bus trip to Washington, D.C., to the Museum of African American History for only $25, and there are scholarships available for students who find that difficult to reach. So please take a look at the website. Lou, anything else before we sign off?
No, I just encourage everybody to follow us on all our social media channels. As Lisa said, search YWCA Hanover, or where you find your favorite podcasts. You'll find some great podcasts, including our wonderful Justine Truxas. Her podcast is leaving everybody in the dirt. She's very popular. And check out our website. We have a lot of programs that are minimal cost for youth, free, and just about helping and improving our communities, which is what we're here for. www.ywcahanover.org.
Okay. And with that, I think we will close it down. We've done well. We got a lot accomplished in an hour. Thank you all very much for a great evening. Have a wonderful rest of the month of April for you. And we'll talk to you next time. Good night.
Good night.